JD, it's great to meet you, sir. Thank you for taking a minute out today.
You too. I appreciate you having me.
Yes, sir. So I'm looking forward to getting into your world of writing. And before we do, I want to know this. 5 years ago, this pandemic changed so many things about our lives. How did you get through the pandemic, and how did it change the way that you approach life and do things today?
On my side, it honestly didn't change a whole lot because I had already been writing full time for about 5 years. So I never leave my house or my desk. Like I think I filled up my car last time with gas like 3 months ago. But we got exposed to it pretty early. We bought a house in New England that we had to completely gut and renovate. So we had contractors just crawling all over this place. And the February of when COVID was, first came out or first showed up, we had a guy working on our staircase, and he had went to Europe and came back, and he was like deathly sick, but he's working and plugging away at it. And then at one point, he just kind of fell over on the stairs, and the other contractors got him out of here and took him over to the emergency care. So we think he had COVID, but this was before it actually had a name or anything.
Yeah.
My wife and I got horribly sick like right after that. We both thought we were going to die for like a week, but there was no testing yet. Like it was too early for all that. We've since had it, I think, 3 different times. Like the subsequent ones weren't that bad. Like I even went out on a run during one of them. But that first one hit us really hard. From a business standpoint, it changed the whole travel landscape because usually typically a book comes out, there's a book tour, I'm flying all over the place and running around the planet. But they nixed all of that, and then Zoom kind of showed up out of nowhere. And we started doing everything on Zoom. And I honestly think the publishers liked that because it was so much cheaper.
Yeah.
But what they've learned over the years is that it's just nowhere near as effective as actually having that author there in person. So even though they don't like paying for the flights and the hotel and all the stuff that surrounds it, having that author just sitting in a room with a bunch of readers, like that is just not something you can recreate online.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. If I was to put you in front of a bunch of 12-year-olds at career day, and it's clear that you're a writer, but all of the things that go into your daily work, if the kid was like, hey, what do you do for a living? How do you answer them?
That's a tough one for me because I grew up. My parents, knew that I liked to write. They encouraged it as a hobby, but they always added this little caveat. They said it's a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So I finished up high school. I went off to college. I've got 2.5 degrees. I ended up working in the finance world, behind a desk, and hated every second of it. And I would come home and I would write at night because that was the thing that I loved to do. And like I would do it for free today if nobody was paying me. Like that was my fun thing. So like those kind of thoughts are flying through my head when I'm in front of a group of students, and I talk to a lot of them, and a lot of times the parents are in the room, and if the parents weren't there, I would probably say, hey kid, follow your dream, do what you want to do because life's a little too short. But if mom and dad are back there and they're funding the 529 plan, hoping their kid's going to go off to college, and I don't necessarily want to be the one to nix that. I saw a clip of I think it was Sylvester Stallone, and I think it was from Tulsa King now that I think about it, but he was talking to somebody about college in general. And he basically, and I'm completely paraphrasing because I forget exactly what he said here, but he essentially explained that the experience of going to college was just as important, if not more important, than actually getting a physical degree in something. Having to be someplace, show up at a certain time, having to do the tests, having to basically perform, and kind of fall into that regiment, like learning that life skill was way more important than actually having a degree in this or that. So my general thinking on it, as much as I would love to tell kids they can skip college and just lock themselves in a room and just start writing stuff, is that they probably should go on to college, get that degree, so they've got it in the back pocket, get that learning experience. Because I didn't write my first novel until I was 43.
Wow.
I had plenty of years, before that. I was working behind the scenes in publishing as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. But during that time, I think that's where I really learned to write. So like I wouldn't necessarily change any of the stuff that I did. I think it all, was important.
It's interesting, being a college graduate and talking to younger people, my stepdaughter and others that will kind of bemoan kind of things they're learning in school. I think, especially with the writer's brain, anything that you can learn that can be coupled with experience of being on this planet long enough is only going to enhance your narrative backbone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just being around other people, You getting exposed to people from different places and people with different experiences. Like I'm like a sponge. I absorb all of that. I can go to a Starbucks and just sit there by myself and eavesdrop on conversations and get ideas for stories. And like without that, if you're just locked in your little bubble, I mean, I spend most of my day behind this desk back here, all by myself. So if I didn't have those kind of experiences, the books I think would be a lot drier. The characters wouldn't feel quite as realistic because I just wouldn't have that knowledge base to pull from.
So when you were 12 years old, was your dream job being a writer?
I think it always was, but I never really, because of what my parents said, never really thought of it as a possible career option. I stumbled into the whole thing. I mean, when I was in college, I worked for BMG Distribution for RCA Records. I was essentially a glorified babysitter. So if they had recording artists come into South Florida, I'd have to pick them up at the airport, get them to the radio station, get them to their concert. If you've ever seen that movie, Get Them to the Greek, that was essentially my life.
Yeah.
But I was in college. College was expensive, and I realized I've got some very famous people in the car with me, sometimes for a week at a time. So I started to interview them, and then I took those interviews and I sold them to magazines like 17 and Teen People and Tiger Beat. And that's essentially how I broke into writing. When you work for newspapers and magazines, pretty much everybody you're working with has a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer. It's like 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's almost done. But they would break those out and show them to me because I was very good with grammar and punctuation and developmental suggestions and things like that. And it turned into this side hustle as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So I kind of fell into all of it. But even then, like I would do that at night. I would work the day gig working in finance during, I did 60 to 80 hours a week doing that. And then I would come home and I would work on these writing projects at night. And I never really thought of them as a career. They paid decent. It was nice to have that supplemental income. But I never really saw it as a career option. Not at first anyway.
It's interesting, shuttling around rock stars and musicians. I was listening to a clip by Peter Criss yesterday, or maybe it was Ace Frehley in light of him passing, and he was like, everybody thinks this is a glamorous lifestyle, that he went through his day itinerary, and it was crazy, and it was a part of that. You're waking up in a town, you immediately have to scarf down food, you got to go get interviewed, you got to do this, you got to transport. For Kiss, you had to spend a long time getting makeup on. Like, everybody thinks this is the perfect ideal life, and they are making a lot of money, but they're always away from their families. They're in a constant rush to go from one thing to another. I mean, Steven Tyler at one point even talked about how insane like his itinerary was for a month, and I was dizzy at the end of it. And that was 1 month in this entire lineage of him living this existence. It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, I have a tough time with it. I was just in Europe. I did a little mini tour. I was in Amsterdam, Germany, and Belgium for the release of something I keep upstairs. And they, exactly like you said, they packed my schedule full. I flew into Amsterdam. I got in at 5 in the morning. Luckily, they gave me that day to kind of recoup. A lot of times they throw me right in a car and you just start everything. But I had that day to basically get level. But the next day, my entire day was completely planned out. It was just interview after interview. 30 minutes for this guy, an hour for this one, first at the hotel, then at another location. Then I had to go and do a book signing, and I didn't get back to my hotel room until I think it was about 11:40 or something that night. It was creeping up on midnight. You eat when you can, and luckily there's people there to help you with all that. But it's stressful, and I'd missed my family. I was only there for a couple of days, but it was long enough. Dan Brown lives down the street from me, and we were emailing a little bit back and forth, and like he did that for 7 weeks, just now for his latest book. And I cannot imagine, picking up and just, traveling the world doing this for seven straight weeks. My head would probably explode.
When you get around that high caliber people, people in the music industry, there's a lot of similarities, but there's some that just stand out. Who was somebody you spent time with that really stood out, that helped you, that were like giving you formative pieces that shaped and developed you into who you are today?
I've been really lucky, and I've never been afraid to ask the question. So if I get contact information from somebody, I will typically reach out. I learned working in the corporate world, if there's something you want to do, and it doesn't matter what it is, look for whoever is the best at it and try to get advice from that person. So I've talked to Stephen King, Dean Koontz, I've known for years now. Dan, I just mentioned. I write books with James Patterson. So I'm constantly picking the brain of these guys that are just a couple levels above me, trying to claw my way up there. I have to interview Patterson next week at the Author Nation conference out out in Vegas. And I'm going through his autobiography right now. And he had a particular line in there that just jumped out at me. He said, "No matter what happens, I just keep chopping the wood." And that's essentially what he does. Like it doesn't matter if somebody throws a curveball at him, if a book sells well, if it sells poorly, he just keeps at it. Whatever life throws at him, he just continues to just keep going and going and going. And you honestly need that. And even working with the people that I did back in the music business, the writers that I know today, they all have that same work ethic. The successful ones. It doesn't matter what gets thrown at them. Because you see a lot of negativity. You get a lot of rejections, all that kind of stuff, and you have to be able to overcome that. But just like Patterson said, he just, he kind of ignores it and just keeps chopping the wood.
So, what was an early book in your life? What was a formative experience with the novel or a piece of writing that made you think, man, I want to read more. I want to do that one day?
Well, I grew up without a TV in the house, so we were reading at a pretty young age. I read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries by the time I got into kindergarten, and then I moved on to the classics like Charles Dickens and stuff like that. My mom owned an antique store, and I remember one time we were at a yard sale, and the guy had a box of books for 25 cents each, and sitting up on top was a copy of Dracula. It was a paperback, was like all shredded and looked like it had been through hell. And I picked it up, and like I knew there was something different about it. It looked very scary. I read the back, and like to me, it felt like a very adult book. I was 8 years old when I found this one. I didn't think my mom would let me buy it, but she did. And I took it home and I completely devoured that book. I flew through it. And it scared the bejesus out of me. Like I had to leave the lights on in my room for like 3 weeks. I would check the closet every night before bed, looked under the bed. I had never gotten an emotional reaction like that out of a book. Like books were always an escape for me. They were entertaining, but this one just took it to a whole other level. And I've honestly been chasing that feeling ever since as a reader and as a writer. I think that's the one, even if I wasn't conscious of it at the time, that's the one that, somewhere in the back of my brain said, you want to do this, you can do this, and, kind of spurred me along.
So, who's been kind of an inspirational force for you to go after this dream? I mean, writing a book later in life is, I mean, it's like you never put that dream to rest and you've realized that you've tasted success. Who's been that inspiration for you?
It's been my wife, to be honest with you. Like when I met her, I was working that corporate gig that I hated. I would come home and I would work on these writing projects at night. I did that for 23 years, and over that time frame, I had 6 different books that I had ghost written that hit the New York Times bestseller list. But they all came out with other people's names on the cover. So when number 6 hit up, this was around 2012, 2013 or so. We sat down and just had a really deep conversation about it. She said, "Listen, I know you want to become an author. Let's find some way to make this happen." But we were kind of trapped because I had a decent job. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, so I had a really strong salary. But we had all the trappings of that. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat. So our lifestyle was expensive, and we couldn't just walk away from that. You can't just turn off your mortgage. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side. We downsized from 4,500 square feet to 800 square feet, and basically got our expenses down to the point where I could live off of savings long enough to write that first book. And for me, luckily, it took off and it all worked out. But if she hadn't pushed me, I'd probably still be working at that corporate job. I'd still be behind a desk doing something I don't like.
So the one thing about writing is that when you see documentaries, you see athletes working out, you see this big build up to the big game, or even entrepreneurs, there's all this footage behind the scenes. But with writers, it tends to be a solitary act. There's not a lot of that expose. So if you could like hang out and be a fly on the wall for any writer in the history of literature and watch how they created, watch what they did. Hemingway with a table full of cats, something like that. Who would be a writer you would love to watch construct their magic?
Well, I've got a podcast that I do once a week called Writers Inc. And we've interviewed literally every author you can possibly think of. And we always get their origin story. And we always get their process out of them. And I think we're on episode like 330 or something now. I have yet to hear the same origin story or the same writer process. Everybody is completely different. So my general takeaway is if I hear something that I think might work, in my world, I tend to just throw it in there and give it a try. For what to answer your question, there's actually a book written by a reporter that sat down. He he literally stayed on Lee Child's couch while he was writing a Jack Reacher novel, and stared over his shoulder, and he watched the book actually come together from beginning to end. And it's a really cool glimpse into not only somebody who's very creative, but the process itself. And they made the idea seem entertaining. Because you're never going to see a reality show about an author. It's you could put a camera in front of my desk and watch me type for 8 hours. That's going to get pretty old.
Yeah.
But they managed to dig in and kind of get to the meat of it. Just simple things like editing. Like most books, I think are made in the editing process. Anybody I think can pound out that first draft, but it's understanding what actually needs to be in the final draft that's important. I try to take away a little bit, here or there. Dean Koontz was very instrumental in helping me shape my writing process, because he told me what he does. He writes a couple thousand words a day, and he starts his day by reviewing whatever he wrote the previous day, and he goes through and he cleans it up, he edits it. By the time he gets finished with that portion, then he hits the ground running on writing the next part because his brain is already back in the story, and it just kind of flows. And I've been doing that ever since he told me about it, and it's been huge. Patterson too. I mean, when I first met him, I was what they call a pantser, and I'm guessing your audience knows the term. And he's a notorious outliner. He writes 30 to 50 pages for every book before he actually starts writing the book. We sat down and we didn't think we'd be able to work together because we were coming at it from those two different camps. And Patterson is very flexible. Ultimately, he decided to pants a novel with me. I'm the only guy who's ever gotten him to do that. So I would write a chapter, I would paint him into some kind of impossible scenario, thinking he's never going to get out of this. And 15 minutes later, he'd send me the next chapter. And not only did he get out, but he put me in an even worse position. And we went back and forth and wrote this crazy, twisty novel. But there were a lot of words on the editing room floor. I think we ended up around 160,000 for the book, and we ended up taking about 40 to 50,000 out before we got to that finished product. But he was, patient. He went with me through that whole thing. And when we finished it, he called me up and said, "Okay, now we did it your way. I want you to try it my way. I'm going to send you an outline." And he sent me an outline that he had written for a book called The Noise. And I honestly saw how much more efficient that writing process was. We had the whole story laid out in front of us. I go for a run every day. I live on a little island in New England, and I do a lap around the island. It's 4.2 miles. It takes me about an hour. And during that time, I used to think about whatever I was writing and what comes next in the story, because I got up from my desk and I left. I have to figure out what comes next so I know what I'm going to do the next day. But when I've got an outline in front of me, I can use that same brain power to figure out how do I make what comes next better, because I already know what comes next, and the books are that much tighter for it. So, at this point, I'm 54. I've been doing this professionally for 11 years. I am still learning. Every day I'm picking up something new, and honestly, I think the day that I stop doing that is probably the day I retire.
So it took you to 43 to do your first one. When you finally did it, what was it like when you got that box of books? When you actually saw it, you got it in your hands, the dream was realized. What was the adrenaline rush that you felt?
It's tough to explain. First of all, I'm autistic, so like I don't celebrate things the way quote unquote normal people do.
Yeah.
As soon as I finished up that first book, I was already working on the second book. Finished up the second one, I was working on the third one. I don't take a day off in between. But I do get joy out of seeing that. I mean, you can see copies of my books behind me. It's all my foreign language copies. To me, that's fun. Just where I get like the reward out of this is like this trip that I just did to Europe. I had a line that was literally like through the door. People were outside waiting for 3 hours before I showed up, and I had never been to that part of the world before, so it was my first time there. And just meeting the fans and seeing how enthusiastic they are, how much they enjoy the books. That's what recharges my batteries, and that's what gets me to keep going.
So ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to you construct these worlds and these stories, and it's a business as well. What is it that gets you when the alarm goes off? What gets you up? What gets you to not only take care of the stories as an author, but your family and your own soul? What is that collective energy for you every day?
I mean, it's a little bit of all of it. I think like the joy that you had mentioned, even though I'm autistic, I don't quite feel that. Like I see it in my wife's eyes. I see it in my daughter's eyes. And to me, that's rewarding. So like being able to give my daughter something that my parents couldn't give me, like anything like the lifestyle that she has right now, it's all based on literally me making shit up. which is crazy to think about. But like, books are paying for everything, and it's allowing us to live a lifestyle that even before, I mean, we had plenty of money, we had nice things, but like that didn't make me happy, and that's one of the things that I actually learned through that whole downsizing process. Like we got rid of so much stuff. Like I didn't really need any of that stuff. Like things that you accumulate in life, it was totally meaningless. It's those little moments, like seeing a smile on my daughter's face. When we did the release for something I keep upstairs, it's a haunted house story, and it's based on a real haunted house that exists like right off the island where I live. We did the book release party out there in the haunted house. We had about 200 people that came out, and we did a book signing there, and my daughter signed every one of those books with me, and she was 7 going on 8 years old at the time. And seeing that, seeing the how excited she was to be able to do that, and just people lined up to get their book signed by my daughter, that makes it all worthwhile.
My son is 20. His name's Miles. He's on the spectrum. So I've been in the special needs world pretty intimately all my life, very involved. And I'm curious in your life and every interaction, especially with caregivers and parents, what was one of the most loving or beneficial things that was done in your upbringing that allowed you to have this confidence to become a writer, to overcome and to evolve into who you are?
Yeah, it honestly came later. I was diagnosed at 22. So I was working the corporate job. I essentially had to monitor the trading activity in this brokerage firm. And if anybody violated a rule or regulation, I'd have to go and, figure out, if something needed to be done to reverse that, or, deal with the consequences of it. So I was fantastic at dealing with the data side. Being autistic, if you put numbers in front of me, I can spend, the whole day doing that and be thrilled with it. But when I actually found a problem, I had to go and talk to real people. And it was a confrontational situation because this person did something wrong. And it always turned into an argument. And my boss was smart enough to realize that I was very good at the one portion of my job, not the other. He thought I had anger management issues, so he sent me to a therapist for anger management. And I was at the initial interview with her. We were about 20 minutes in, and she stopped me and she said, "Have you ever been tested for autism?" And I honestly didn't even know what that was. And she said, "Well, the whole time we've been talking, you haven't made eye contact with me. I notice you rub your thumb and your forefinger together whenever you're putting a thought together." She just started rattling off all these different things, and then she asked if I'd be interested in getting tested, and I did. And then once we landed on a diagnosis, at the time they called it Asperger's syndrome. In today's world, you're just on the spectrum somewhere. But once I had that in front of me, I had a problem I could solve, and that was life altering for me. So even though this was just a therapist that my boss basically put me in front of, I didn't even want to go. She changed my life.
Wow.
And having somebody there that was able to recognize that, and like it was a total fluke because she was there for an anger management class, but she spends her days working with autistic children, so she knew what to look for. So like all these different things had to align in order for that to happen. So I'm forever grateful to that woman.
So I just accidentally stumbled into a book called Happiness Falls by Angie Kim, and it's kind of a thriller about a dad with a son that is nonverbal and he's missing, and it's really turning into a good book. And I ask you and bring this up. Do you ever read books that are kind of centered around that theme of autism and spectrum and that kind of world?
I don't seek them out, but I've read plenty of them. When it's done right, it's fantastic. When
Yeah,
it's done wrong, it can be horrible.
yeah,
One of my favorite movies on this subject is The Accountant with Ben Affleck.
yeah.
It's an action thriller. He's a hitman who's autistic,
Uh-huh.
but they nail every aspect of it in that movie and his personality. Not so much the second one. They made a sequel a couple of years ago, but that first one is spot on.
Yeah,
And I love it when I see that kind of thing because I think it's important for other people to see it,
yeah.
and to realize that, from my standpoint, there are good parts and there are bad parts. I doubled down on the good ones, and I've been working ever since to try and resolve the bad ones. And I think it's important to put that out there. I speak to a lot of parents that have autistic children, and if they've got a kid who's like a year and a half old, who's literally sitting on the floor banging its head against the wall, until it screams or there's blood, like that's a difficult thing as a parent to deal with. But them seeing somebody like me who's on the flip side of that, in his 50s now, I've gone through, because I used to do that same thing. They know that there's a light at the end of that tunnel. You have to find it. And I think just the dialogue in general is huge, and it's not something that they had back in the 70s when I was a kid,
Hmm.
but it's certainly out there now.
Yeah, it is. So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight and you walked into your childhood home and ran into the 16-year-old version of you, and you had kind of a picture book of your life, and you sat down and showed it to that version of you, would that young version of you believe the way that your life has turned out?
Probably not. And to be honest with you, I don't know that I would show it to him because I wouldn't want to change anything.
Yeah.
I've read enough time travel books to know how dangerous that is.
Yes.
Everything that's happened to me has happened for a reason. Even starting my first book at 43, I could have easily started writing in my 20s if I wanted to, but I needed that learning curve. All that time that I spent working with agents and editors and polishing other people's manuscripts, that's where I really cut my teeth and learned how to do this. So I wouldn't change a single thing.
So have you saved rejection letters? Do you have a notebook full of them?
I honestly didn't get that many, and
Okay.
I know that sounds crass. So with my first book, Forsaken, I knew how to write a book. I had no clue how to query an agent. So I bought a list, an Excel spreadsheet that had 200 agents on there with their email addresses. I sent them all a form letter. To whom it may concern, this is what my book is about. Here's the first three chapters. I didn't look at their websites to see what specs they wanted, because they're all different. Some want to see the first chapter, some want to see three chapters. I ignored all of that and just kind of sent it out. And I didn't get any rejections. I didn't get any responses. The second time around, I ended up selling a lot of copies of that book, which put me on the radar of the traditional guys. If the agents and stuff Googled me, like they saw that sales record. So when I had The Fourth Monkey ready, which was my second novel, I queried 53 agents. That time I actually did it the right way. I looked at their specs and I got 13 offers of representation within about 2 weeks. So then I felt like the kid in high school who plays football really well, and I had to pick my college. I kind of went from no rejections to that. But I've gotten rejections since then, if anything, from publishers. Like they turn down a book. You get an agent because it doesn't stop with just getting the agent. Once you get an agent, that agent has to submit the book. So they send it out to all these publishers, and then rejections start coming in from them. So like I've dealt with that. You've got to have a thick skin. I read every review that I see posted on Goodreads and Amazon and all that. The good ones, the bad ones. If there's a bad review, I try to pick it apart and see if there's a valid point in there. A lot of times there is, something that I could change, something I could have done better, and I just incorporate that and move on. Just like Patterson, just keep chopping the wood.
Yeah. So anytime you have a dream, you kind of construct this ideological world of how your life is going to turn out. You decided you want to be a writer at 43. You have this notion of living the dream out, writing and doing it. But there's the difference between the dream, there's the reality of how it turned out. What's the gray matter between the dream you had of being a writer and the actual fact that it worked out and you're living it right now?
I it's whew, that's a little tricky. I think I had so many friends, not like in the music business where they had a song that hit, and all of a sudden they're number one. Everybody knows who they are. I've got author friends that I've worked with. It's the same kind of deal. They write this book and just completely hit it out of the park, and now all of a sudden they can't go to a restaurant anymore. That's the way that I expected it to be, but it's not really like that unless you have one of those. Unless you write Gone Girl or you have some huge giant hit. It's not one of those things. It's not like somebody flips a switch and all of a sudden everybody knows who you are. In my world, like it's almost like a boat in a harbor and the tide is just going up. Like it seems like with every release, more people seem to know who I am. I get more press. I sell more copies. Everyone is just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. To now, like I do get recognized occasionally when I go outside. 5 years ago, I didn't. So and I honestly prefer that. I think it's better to have it steadily rise versus the just overnight thing. Because I had plenty of people that I knew back in the music days that just completely crashed and burned when that happened. They had a huge number one song, that everybody was singing. They went out and they bought the big house on South Beach. They had a Lamborghini, they had this, they had that. 6 months later, they're three songs in and they're not doing quite as well. The mansion goes away. They've got a nice apartment. The Lamborghini goes away. They're driving a Volvo. Like you see the slip backwards too. But the people that I know in this industry that have been steady about it, Jeffrey Deaver is probably a great example. One of his first books was Bone Collector, which there was a movie and stuff for, so a lot of people knew what that was. But over the years, he's just steadily put out good book after good book after good book, and the bulk of them hit the New York Times list. But most people wouldn't necessarily recognize him on the street. But he has built up this huge following over time, and I think that is just better. Because who wants to be home writing the sequel to Gone Girl right now?
Yeah.
Gillian Flynn is trying to do that. That's tough.
Yeah, she's actually so a couple of her books are based in Kansas City, interestingly enough. She's from the area, so um she's phenomenal. It's interesting. After David Bowie passed, I have a jazz radio show. I interviewed Donnie McCaslin. He's a saxophonist, and he happened to be a cat that David just saw at one point, hired him for his final album. And I interviewed him about 2 months after Bowie passed, and everything was just getting intense, like the media and everything. And he was in his hotel and he just sounded almost terrified. That overnight thing. You know what I'm talking about? Like what you're saying, like when we see these biopics of people that just overnight become Elvis or the Beatles when they came to America, it's just overwhelming. So, yeah, with you saying that kind of slow rise, you have a minute to breathe every day, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's nice. I had over 1,000 people that showed up at my signing event in Belgium. But like I had to go to that event, and like those people knew who I was because I was supposed to be there. I'm fairly recognizable because of the hair, but like I have to be in that particular environment. Like where people are expecting me to be there. If I'm just walking around in the grocery store, it's usually not a thing. And there's a big difference there. Like if I go out to lunch with James Patterson, we get interrupted 4, 5, sometimes 10 times. From just fans and staff members, and the manager's got to come out, the chef's got to come out. That's his world. Like he can't go anywhere anymore without that. And I don't know that I necessarily want that.
Yeah.
Like I enjoy writing the books. It's fun to deal with the people. But I don't know that I want that level.
So you've clearly been successful in your life. You've found your dream. But at the end of the day, what are you ultimately the proudest of out of everything that's happened, everything you've evolved to at this point in your life?
Honestly, it's the family. Like that's the most important piece out of all of it. Early on when I started selling a lot of books, particularly in foreign territories, I would get interview requests at crazy hours of the night, 11 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. I would take all of them, and I was quickly burning out. I knew it wasn't sustainable. So I drew a line in the sand, and I told my agents, I'm not going to do anything after 3 o'clock anymore, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when my quitting bell rings. I go for that run around the island, and then I come home and I spend the rest of the night with my wife and daughter, just being a dad. And to me, like that's what makes it all worthwhile.
So at the end of the day, JD, everyone has a perception of you. Family, friends, fans, everyone in the business world that is a part of the literary environment. But you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, I'm horribly critical on of myself. I don't necessarily measure the successes. I don't celebrate them. My brain tends to focus on the negative stuff, for better or worse. Like if you put a book in front of me, I want to know what's wrong with that book so that I can try to fix it. I don't care about the stuff that's right, because that doesn't need to be touched. But because of that, I think in a lot of ways I'm perceived as being very negative. But at the same time, by doing that, it's gotten me to the level where I am. So I don't necessarily want to change it. So I spend a lot of time explaining that to people. I'm working with Patterson. He's been helping me kind of recreate his business model. I recently signed a deal with Simon and Schuster where I created my own imprint on Simon and Schuster, and I've been bringing in co-authors. So I'm working with a lot of other people, and I'm basically holding their hand through the writing process. I'm helping them create the idea. I'm helping them create the outline, helping them draft the book. So I'm purposely trying to find a couple of the good parts that I can talk about, along with all the things I know we have to fix. I'll go through that outline. I'll make a list of everything I know that has to be corrected on that outline. I try to find one or two good things, just something to, so that I'm just not coming at them with all the negative. I'm just trying to find a balance there.
So let me ask you this. If we get off this call, time machine pulls up in front of your house on Halloween, and you can climb in and go back in the history of recorded time and see one event. You won't create a tear in time. You can just watch it unfold. What event in human history would you love to have had a front seat to?
I'm a music buff. Like you brought up Elvis. I would like to see Elvis, like way back in the day right before he first broke,
Yeah.
just to see what that was like.
What was the first live show you saw? First concert that just blew you away?
I've been at a bunch of them just because of what I used to do. And, it's the same kind of thing. I didn't get to enjoy it because I was working.
Uh,
One of the biggest shows I was at, it was Guns N' Roses on New Year's Eve in 1990 or 91 at
wow.
Joe Robbie Stadium. And I was backstage for the whole thing, and that was probably the biggest show those guys have ever put on. But like I saw half the show because I was in the back. I was doing other stuff. So I missed a lot of really. I was hanging out with the crowd. I was there at all the shows, but I was off doing something else, so I missed a lot of that.
Yeah.
It felt very odd for me to actually go to a concert and just sit in the seat. Like I had never done that before.
Yeah. So JD, if anyone wants to get your books, if anybody wants to reach out, any of the good business in your world, where do they go?
Easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. The books are pretty much in every bookstore. The latest release is called Something I Keep Upstairs. That one just came out in May.
Wonderful. JD, thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your story and talking about the spectrum and autism world. It's obviously near and dear to me. So this has been wonderful all the way around to have this moment. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.